The shadows of New York have always carried stories whispered only in quiet corners, behind locked doors, and in the smoke-filled rooms where the powerful and the dangerous gathered. Among those shadows, one name carved itself into the city's consciousness not through flamboyance or loud displays of authority, but through a silent, almost invisible force that made even the bravest pause. Albert Anastasia moved through the world as though it were a chessboard, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. Unlike the loud and boisterous figures that often dominated the newspapers, Anastasia's power was not in spectacle, it was in the way he could make fear appear without raising his voice, in the way he could command obedience without speaking more than necessary. The streets seemed to bend to his presence, as if the very night itself conspired to keep him hidden, yet always felt him watching. Even those who knew him well often described him in hushed tones, careful not to draw attention. There was a peculiar aura about Anastasia, a mixture of calm calculation and the subtle threat of violence. One could meet him for a casual conversation, feel the gentle cadence of his words, and yet leave the room with a lingering unease, an inexplicable tension that suggested the man before them held the power of life and death, and that it would be granted or withdrawn according to rules no one else could understand. In a city teeming with ambition, crime, and greed, he emerged not as a spectacle but as a force of inevitability, a quiet reminder that even in the most crowded of streets, a single shadow could dominate entire blocks. Anastasia's reputation was built not just on the acts he committed or ordered, but on the meticulous precision with which he operated. Unlike other gangsters who relied on theatrics, he cultivated an image of unpredictability. Those who dealt with him quickly learned that no detail could be ignored, no slight overlooked, and no trust given lightly. He inspired loyalty only when it aligned with survival, and fear when it aligned with respect. The very air seemed to shift around him, carrying the weight of unseen consequences. Even the most confident of men hesitated when his presence loomed, sensing without words that this was a man who measured the world in a different way. To understand Anastasia, one had to see the city through his eyes, the dark alleys where silence could be broken with a single misstep, the elegant offices where deals were struck with the quietest of handshakes, the docks where crates of goods hid secrets heavier than steel. Every environment was a potential stage for his influence, every shadow a potential witness to his strategy. He moved through this landscape like a master of an unseen game, calculating the movements of rivals, allies, and lawmen alike. The very notion of power in his world was intertwined with control, and control was inseparable from fear. Yet, there was also a subtle paradox to his power. While Anastasia was feared by many, he remained deeply, almost painfully isolated. Trust was a rare commodity, and he hoarded it with the same care as his most valuable assets. His closest allies were often kept at a measured distance, aware that intimacy could easily turn into betrayal. And yet, this very isolation only enhanced the mystique surrounding him. In the city's underworld, where loyalty was as fragile as the autumn leaves drifting through the streets, the Lord of Murder Incorporated commanded attention not just because of what he did, but because of what no one ever knew about him. The unknown bred awe, and awe became a weapon. New York itself seemed to respond to his presence. The hum of the elevated trains, the echo of footsteps along cobblestone streets, the flickering lamplight in narrow corridors, all of it took on a new meaning when seen through the lens of someone like Anastasia. Danger was never loud, it was always patient, always waiting. And he understood this instinctively. While others made mistakes in haste or hubris, he thrived in calculated patience. To him, every moment held potential, every silence held opportunity. He knew that in the world of crime, the smallest misstep could cost a life, a fortune, or both. It was this combination of silent authority and meticulous calculation that would come to define him, making him both legendary and terrifying. Even those who sought to challenge him found themselves caught in webs they could barely perceive. His influence was not exercised through armies or public spectacle, but through the careful orchestration of actions, the unseen strings that bound his world together. Each decision, each glance, each command was deliberate, and its consequences rippled far beyond what anyone else could anticipate. In a city full of chaos, he was the calm at the center, and it was precisely this calm that made his presence so unnerving. And yet, the question remained, how did a man so ruthless maintain his empire without succumbing to the very violence he wielded? How did someone who trusted no one navigate a world built on betrayal, greed, and ambition? The answer lay in a mixture of fear, intelligence, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. But even so, the shadows of suspicion followed him relentlessly, whispering that no matter how careful, even the Lord of Murder Incorporated could not escape the inevitability of conflict. As we begin to trace the life of Albert Anastasia, we step into a world where silence carried weight, where decisions were measured in blood and opportunity, and where one man's quiet presence could alter the fate of countless lives. It is a story of power and paranoia, of strategy and violence, told not in the blare of headlines but in the subtle rhythms of a city that never sleeps. And in this calm recounting, we begin to understand the enigma, a man who trusted no one, yet whose influence shaped the very foundations of organized crime in America. Albert Anastasia's story begins not in the crowded streets of New York, but in the rugged hills and quiet villages of Calabria, Italy. It was a place of ancient traditions, where the rhythm of life was dictated as much by the land as by the unspoken codes of family and community. The sun-baked hills and narrow stone pathways held stories of survival and resilience, shaping young men in ways that would echo far beyond their hometowns. It was in this environment, amidst poverty and strict social hierarchies, that Anastasia first learned to navigate a world defined by power, loyalty, and, often, fear. Life here was simple in appearance, yet beneath the surface, every action carried consequence. A careless word, a broken promise, or a challenge to authority could reverberate across the village in ways both immediate and lasting. From an early age, Albert understood that life was a negotiation, and that survival required a keen awareness of those around him. Families were tightly bound, but alliances and rivalries existed in equal measure, shaping the social fabric of the region. He observed the ways adults dealt with disputes, how silence could be as powerful as speech, and how fear was often a tool wielded with precision. Even as a boy, there was a clarity to his understanding of human behavior, a recognition that strength did not always lie in brute force but in anticipation, strategy, and an unwavering presence. In Calabria, lessons were rarely taught through words alone, they were learned by watching, by sensing, by understanding the subtle signals that others overlooked. The landscape itself mirrored the harsh realities of life. Steep hills and rocky terrain demanded resilience and determination, and the small villages, perched precariously on cliffs or tucked into valleys, seemed insulated yet exposed all at once. The seasons dictated labor and sustenance, and the rhythms of the natural world reinforced the idea that survival was earned, not given. Young Albert moved through these spaces with a keen eye, noticing both opportunity and threat. He learned early on that the world was indifferent to weakness, and that only those who understood the hidden rules could thrive. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a reflective nature that hinted at a mind constantly analyzing, assessing, and preparing. Family life was both a source of connection and tension. Strong bonds provided a foundation, yet the rigid expectations of loyalty and obedience left little room for error. In a household where respect and duty were paramount, young Albert observed the ways in which power and influence were exercised subtly, sometimes invisibly, and always with careful calculation. Arguments were often settled behind closed doors, disputes whispered through corridors, and lessons reinforced by observation rather than lecture. It was in this environment that the seeds of his meticulous nature were sown, shaping a man who would one day move through the underworld with similar precision. Poverty and scarcity were constant companions. Food was often simple, clothing worn, and comforts rare, yet these hardships instilled resilience and adaptability. Albert saw firsthand how necessity could drive cunning, how a single clever action might tip the balance between survival and misfortune. The world outside his village was distant but looming, stories of emigration and opportunity filtering in like faint winds. Young men spoke of America, of cities bursting with wealth, of possibilities that seemed both tantalizing and perilous. For Anastasia, these tales planted a seed of ambition, a recognition that the life he knew was bounded, but the world beyond offered endless, if dangerous, potential. The local culture, with its strict codes of honor and secrecy, left a lasting imprint on him. Every gesture, every expression, every word carried meaning. Subtlety was valued over overt declarations. Betrayal was met with swift consequence, and trust was a carefully negotiated commodity. In these early years, Albert observed that power often resided not in the visible demonstration of strength, but in the quiet management of perception. A glance could communicate warning, a pause could assert dominance, and an action taken with foresight could change the trajectory of an entire household or neighborhood. The young boy internalized these lessons, absorbing the nuances of human behavior with a meticulous attention that would define him later in life. Even in moments of play or childhood innocence, he displayed a sharp awareness of his surroundings. Games were not simply distractions, they were practice in strategy, observation, and leadership. He noticed which peers followed without question, which challenged authority, and which could be persuaded or intimidated. These early observations, though subtle, were building blocks for a mindset that would later excel in the high-stakes world of organized crime. It was as though the landscape of Calabria itself had trained him for the challenges of a larger, more ruthless stage. As the years passed, the stories of distant lands, especially America, grew more compelling. Letters from relatives, tales of opportunity, and the allure of a city alive with possibility painted a vision of a different life, one where skill, cunning, and boldness could translate into power unimaginable in the narrow confines of Calabria. Yet even this vision carried risk. For a boy shaped by the harsh lessons of his homeland, the promise of opportunity was inseparable from the potential for betrayal, danger, and moral compromise. The awareness of risk became ingrained, and with it, a philosophy of measured action and careful observation. It was in this crucible of environment, family, and culture that Albert Anastasia took his earliest steps toward becoming a figure of both fascination and fear. The rugged hills, the silent streets, the unspoken codes, and the omnipresent threat of consequence shaped a mind attuned to both opportunity and danger. He learned that power was not merely seized but cultivated, that survival required not only strength but patience, and that trust was the rarest and most valuable of commodities. These formative experiences laid the foundation for a man who would one day move through the streets of New York with the same quiet calculation, the same measured presence, and the same unyielding control that had been instilled in him long before he ever set foot on American soil. And so, the boy from Calabria, carrying the weight of his upbringing, the lessons of his family, and the instincts honed in the hills of southern Italy, began the journey that would transform him from a young immigrant into the Lord of Murder Incorporated, a man who trusted no one, yet whose influence would leave an indelible mark on the underworld of New York City. The seeds sown in these early years would germinate slowly, eventually blossoming into a legend defined by both fear and meticulous mastery, a life forged in the quiet, sun-baked villages of his youth and realized in the shadows of a city that never truly sleeps. The voyage from the sun-drenched hills of Calabria to the bustling streets of New York was as much a journey of the mind as it was of the body for Albert Anastasia. The ocean stretched endlessly, a gray expanse that mirrored both hope and uncertainty. Each wave carried with it the promise of opportunity, yet also the whisper of risk, reminding him that life beyond the familiar landscapes of his childhood would demand vigilance, adaptability, and cunning. On board the crowded steamship, among the sea of immigrants clutching their meager belongings, he observed human behavior with a quiet intensity. Faces reflected fear, excitement, exhaustion, and anticipation, and Albert, even in his youth, sensed the subtle power dynamics at play. It was a microcosm of the world he was about to enter, a lesson in survival through observation and careful attention. Ellis Island was the threshold to a new reality, a place where dreams were filtered through scrutiny, where questions could determine freedom or delay, where the city beyond beckoned with both promise and peril. The noise, the confusion, and the constant movement of people created a sense of controlled chaos. Anastasia moved with cautious purpose, understanding instinctively that in this new world, as in his homeland, awareness was the first line of protection. Every glance mattered, every gesture could reveal strength or vulnerability. He noted the men who sought to assert dominance through intimidation, the women who projected resilience, the families who whispered their fears and hopes into the cold morning air. In these moments, he absorbed lessons that would later prove invaluable in the underworld: patience, observation, and the understanding that power often resided in the unseen and unspoken. Stepping onto the streets of New York, Albert was immediately confronted by a world that was both dazzling and daunting. The city moved with a relentless energy, a ceaseless hum that carried opportunity and danger in equal measure. The clatter of elevated trains, the shouting of vendors, the horse-drawn carriages jostling with early automobiles, all created a sensory overload for newcomers, yet Albert's mind parsed the chaos with precision. He noticed the way certain neighborhoods were ruled quietly, the subtle signs of influence and control, a nod from a man at a corner, the careful spacing of businesses, the glances exchanged by those who understood the invisible hierarchy that governed the streets. Even the air itself seemed charged with possibility and peril, and he learned quickly that to thrive here, one had to understand both the seen and the unseen forces at play. Early on, Anastasia encountered figures who would subtly shape his understanding of the criminal world. He saw men who commanded loyalty through respect and fear, who negotiated territory and influence with quiet gestures rather than public spectacle. He observed the delicate balance between cooperation and rivalry, noting how a misplaced word or hasty action could destabilize entire networks. The immigrant neighborhoods, densely packed and teeming with ambition, offered both shelter and threat. For a young man accustomed to the rigid codes of Calabria, the streets of New York presented a different set of rules, ones that required adaptation, strategic patience, and a constant assessment of human behavior. In these formative months, Albert began to test the waters of survival in the city's underworld. Small jobs, menial labor, and the occasional brush with petty crime introduced him to the dynamics of power, reward, and consequence. He learned quickly that opportunities were often layered with hidden risks, and that trust was scarce and earned slowly. The skills honed in Calabria, keen observation, patience, understanding of human motivations, became his most valuable tools. He understood that survival depended not just on strength, but on strategy, discretion, and the ability to anticipate the intentions of others. The city itself was an education, offering lessons in contrast and consequence. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, opulence brushing against squalor in a way that was both breathtaking and sobering. The aromas of street food mingled with the stench of overcrowded tenements, the laughter of children echoed beside cries of despair, and the light of neon signs glinted off wet cobblestones after evening rain. Each detail was recorded, each pattern noted, as Albert internalized the rhythms of his new world. He saw the vulnerabilities of those who flaunted power without understanding it, the subtle methods by which influence was exercised, and the quiet ways in which fear could enforce obedience. Early encounters with local gangs and criminal figures were cautious and measured. He learned that aggression without calculation invited disaster, and that patience often yielded greater advantage. In a city where allegiance was fragile and betrayal common, he began to understand the necessity of discretion, the importance of controlling both appearance and perception. Anastasia observed the hierarchy of influence, noting how reputation could be built quietly, maintained meticulously, and destroyed suddenly. He saw that those who wielded fear effectively did so with subtlety, leaving a lingering psychological imprint on those around them. Through work and observation, Anastasia gradually carved a place for himself in this complex social ecosystem. He was not yet the feared Lord of Murder Incorporated, but the foundation of his future power was already taking shape. Each decision, each cautious interaction, each test of patience honed his instincts, preparing him for the dangerous ascent that lay ahead. He understood the importance of alliances, the risk of overconfidence, and the value of measured action. In this crowded, energetic, and unforgiving city, he learned to navigate not just the streets, but the intricate web of human ambition and fear that defined New York's criminal underworld. Even as he settled into this new life, the memory of Calabria remained a guiding force. The lessons of his youth, the observation of human behavior, the understanding of loyalty and consequence, the cultivation of patience and precision, were inseparable from his identity. They were the compass that would guide him through New York's labyrinth of opportunity and danger, shaping decisions that were as calculated as they were inevitable. Anastasia carried both the hopes of his family and the weight of his upbringing into this new world, a combination of ambition and caution that would define his rise to power. And so, in the bustling, unrelenting streets of New York, Albert Anastasia began the next chapter of his life. The young immigrant, shaped by the hills of southern Italy and honed by observation and quiet resolve, stepped carefully into a world of opportunity and threat. Every glance, every gesture, every choice mattered, and he understood that his survival and future influence would depend on mastering both. The stage was set for a journey that would lead him from the margins of society to the pinnacle of organized crime, where fear, strategy, and meticulous planning would become his currency, and where his silent, watchful presence would leave an indelible mark on the city he now called home. The streets of New York in the early decades of the 20th century were a labyrinth of opportunity and danger, a place where every corner could conceal fortune or misfortune, and every shadow could hide friend or foe. For Albert Anastasia, now acclimated to the rhythm of the city, life was a constant lesson in survival and adaptation. The lessons from Calabria, patience, observation, and understanding human behavior, served him well, but in this new environment, stakes were higher and consequences more immediate. The city demanded not only skill but a keen awareness of who could be trusted, and more importantly, who could not. Early on, Anastasia found himself drawn into petty crimes, not out of ambition alone, but as a means of navigating a world that was unforgiving to newcomers. Small robberies, occasional extortion, and involvement in minor street fights offered him both income and a first-hand education in the mechanics of urban survival. Each encounter was a test, a subtle challenge to his instincts and judgment. He learned quickly that while force could command temporary attention, it was intelligence, timing, and the careful management of perception that ensured lasting influence. Even a seemingly insignificant decision, a choice of whom to confront, whom to ally with, could determine survival. The neighborhoods themselves were microcosms of the wider underworld. Crowded tenements, bustling markets, and narrow alleys were arenas where hierarchy and influence were constantly negotiated. Every resident had a story, and every action had a ripple effect. Anastasia observed how local gangs maintained control, how disputes were mediated, and how fear could enforce compliance. He understood that dominance was not merely physical, it was psychological. The careful calibration of intimidation, subtle gestures, and strategic alliances created an invisible web of power, and Anastasia began to weave himself into its threads, quietly but decisively. His reputation started to grow not through notoriety, but through efficiency and discretion. Unlike some of the more flamboyant criminals who drew attention with reckless violence, Anastasia's actions were deliberate and measured. He struck only when necessary, choosing timing, method, and audience with precision. The impact of a single act often outweighed the noise of many, and those who crossed him learned that his presence carried consequences that extended beyond immediate observation. His growing notoriety was not built on spectacle, it was built on the quiet certainty that he would not be challenged lightly, that any transgression against him or his interests would be met with calculated and inevitable response. The nature of early criminal activity also offered him insight into human behavior on a granular level. He noticed patterns, who could be persuaded, who could be intimidated, and who might betray loyalty for a fleeting advantage. Each interaction became a lesson in control, each decision a test of judgment. The ability to read people, to anticipate reactions, and to manage outcomes became as valuable as any physical skill. Anastasia's mind absorbed these nuances, shaping a strategy for power that was both subtle and unrelenting, where foresight mattered more than brute strength. The city, in its chaotic energy, provided endless opportunities for observation and refinement. From the bustling docks to dimly lit storefronts, from crowded public squares to quiet back alleys, every environment offered lessons in influence and strategy. He watched rival gangs negotiate territory with silent gestures, and he observed law enforcement cautiously as they attempted to impose order in a city that often defied it. Through these experiences, Anastasia began to understand the delicate balance between power and risk, and the importance of patience in seizing opportunities that might initially seem inconspicuous. Despite the danger and constant vigilance, there was also a rhythm to this life. The pulse of the city, its movement of goods, people, and information, became a backdrop against which Anastasia honed his skills. He learned when to act and when to wait, when to engage directly and when to manipulate circumstances from behind the scenes. Violence, while always a possibility, was wielded sparingly, reserved for moments that demanded precision and conveyed a lasting message. In this way, he began to distinguish himself from others, cultivating a reputation not for impulsive brutality, but for strategic ruthlessness. Even his early mistakes became lessons. Encounters gone awry, disagreements with peers, or misjudgments in timing reinforced the necessity of meticulous planning and observation. Anastasia internalized these experiences, refining his approach, strengthening his instincts, and learning to anticipate both the overt and subtle threats that surrounded him. In this way, the city itself became his classroom, and its streets were both challenge and teacher. Each day offered a lesson in trust, calculation, and the management of perception, all of which would later define his dominance in Murder Incorporated. The gradual ascent through the lower ranks of organized crime also offered a glimpse into the complex social dynamics of the underworld. Power was rarely absolute, it required constant negotiation, vigilance, and subtle exertion. Alliances were fluid, and betrayal could emerge unexpectedly. Anastasia understood that survival depended not only on physical ability but on psychological acuity, and he refined both with meticulous care. He learned to move silently through conversations, to observe tensions that others ignored, and to recognize opportunities to influence outcomes without revealing his hand. In those early years, the young immigrant was transforming before the eyes of the city itself. The boy who had arrived with uncertainty was becoming a figure defined by calculation, restraint, and awareness. His reputation for efficiency and controlled ruthlessness began to spread quietly, whispered through neighborhoods and among those who recognized subtle power when they saw it. By the time he moved from small street-level crimes to more organized operations, he had already cultivated a psychological edge over both allies and adversaries, a keen sense of timing, a deep understanding of human behavior, and a growing awareness that trust was a precious and dangerous commodity. And so, in the crowded, ever-moving streets of New York, Albert Anastasia continued to build the foundation of a life that would eventually reach the highest echelons of organized crime. Through observation, patience, and calculated action, he began to carve a path from the margins of society into the core of a network defined by power, fear, and loyalty. Every alley, every whispered deal, every careful interaction honed him, shaping a man who would later wield influence over an empire of violence with quiet authority. The early years of crime were not merely acts of survival, they were the forging of a mind capable of both ruthless strategy and unparalleled control, setting the stage for a rise that would become the legend of the Lord of Murder Incorporated. As Albert Anastasia navigated the crowded, chaotic streets of New York, he began encountering men who would shape not only his understanding of power but also the blueprint of his own ascent. These figures, already established in the hidden hierarchies of organized crime, moved through the city with a quiet authority that fascinated and intimidated in equal measure. They were mentors of a peculiar kind, teaching not through instruction, but through example, observation, and subtle challenges. Each encounter was a lesson in loyalty, strategy, and the careful orchestration of fear. For Anastasia, who had already honed his instincts on the streets, these relationships provided insight into the mechanics of influence on a larger scale. The mentors he encountered varied in temperament and style, yet they shared a common understanding: power was not simply taken, it was cultivated. Anastasia observed their every move with a calculating eye, noting the delicate balance between respect and intimidation, loyalty and fear. These men wielded authority with precision, using both visible action and unseen implication to command obedience. In their presence, young Albert understood that in order to survive and thrive, one had to anticipate the intentions of others, manipulate perception, and act decisively without hesitation. Each subtle gesture, each measured word, became a lesson in the art of control. Among these early influences were figures whose reputations extended far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. They carried the weight of history, alliances, and rivalries, and every interaction was infused with the potential for both opportunity and danger. Anastasia learned to navigate these complexities with a careful balance of deference and assertiveness. To misstep, even slightly, could mean alienation or worse. But to observe keenly, act judiciously, and recognize when patience would yield more than aggression, could mark the difference between obscurity and power. The streets of New York, already a harsh teacher, now intersected with the refined, strategic lessons of seasoned criminals who understood the interplay of influence and intimidation better than anyone else. These mentors also revealed to him the subtle mechanisms of organized crime, the ways in which influence extended beyond the immediate act of violence or theft into the orchestration of entire networks. Anastasia watched as agreements were negotiated quietly in back rooms, as territory was asserted through silent gestures rather than open confrontation, and as reputation could be managed with as much care as wealth. He learned that a leader's strength often lay not in the number of men under his command, but in his ability to inspire fear and respect simultaneously, to make others question both their loyalty and their own understanding of events. In absorbing these lessons, Anastasia's own emerging style began to take shape, a combination of meticulous planning, psychological insight, and disciplined action. Trust, he observed, was the rarest currency of all. The mentors he encountered emphasized that alliances were fragile and often temporary, and that betrayal lurked in the most unlikely places. Anastasia internalized this early and profoundly. While he learned to work with others, to navigate the complex web of relationships that defined organized crime, he also began cultivating a philosophy of caution and discretion. Observation became his constant companion, and even in moments of camaraderie, he measured motives, analyzed gestures, and anticipated outcomes. This careful approach would later become the cornerstone of his reputation as a man who trusted no one, a man whose loyalty was reserved and whose caution was legendary. The lessons extended beyond strategy into the practicalities of survival and advancement. Anastasia watched how these experienced figures handled law enforcement, navigated disputes, and maintained order within their own ranks. He learned the importance of patience in executing plans, the value of timing in acts of aggression, and the subtle art of maintaining authority without overt displays of force. In each encounter, he absorbed the underlying principles of leadership in a world defined by both visible and invisible power. Every conversation, every meeting, and even the quietest exchanges carried lessons in manipulation, timing, and risk assessment. Yet, alongside mentorship, there were tests. Anastasia was measured, challenged, and occasionally tested by these men who recognized potential but also understood the dangers of overconfidence. He was forced to make decisions under pressure, to navigate ethical gray zones, and to prove that he could balance ambition with discretion. In these moments, his intelligence and composure were sharpened, and the subtle interplay of risk and reward became second nature. Each success reinforced his understanding that in the world of organized crime, power was not granted, it was earned through meticulous calculation and an unwavering awareness of consequences. The mentors themselves were often paradoxes, ruthless in action, yet precise in strategy, feared by many, yet respected by those who understood the balance of fear and control. Anastasia absorbed these contradictions, learning that strength was multifaceted, that influence could be cultivated quietly, and that psychological mastery often outweighed physical dominance. He began to understand that his own potential lay not in imitating others, but in synthesizing these lessons into a style uniquely his own, a combination of silent authority, calculated aggression, and relentless observation. In time, these relationships also introduced him to the broader network of organized crime, including the complex interplay between local gangs, immigrant communities, and emerging power structures. He began to see the ways in which alliances could shift, how rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and how a single misstep could cascade into chaos. With each observation, Anastasia refined his instincts, learning not only to survive but to anticipate, to manipulate outcomes, and to exert influence even when seemingly powerless. The foundation of his future empire was being laid in these quiet moments of learning and adaptation, moments that were invisible to most, but essential to his eventual rise. By the end of these formative years with mentors, Albert Anastasia had absorbed a sophisticated understanding of power, loyalty, and fear. He had witnessed firsthand the balance between patience and aggression, discretion and action, trust and caution. Each lesson, subtle and deliberate, reinforced the principles that would later define him: meticulous planning, psychological insight, and an unwavering awareness of the dangerous world he inhabited. In learning from those who had come before him, he was not merely following a path, he was quietly constructing his own, one that would eventually elevate him to the feared and respected position of the Lord of Murder Incorporated. The formation of Murder Incorporated marked a turning point not only for Albert Anastasia, but for the very nature of organized crime in New York. By the early 1930s, the city had become a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and opportunities, each demanding strategic foresight and ruthless precision. Anastasia, now seasoned by years of observation, survival, and minor criminal enterprise, recognized a critical need: control could not rely solely on brute force, it required an organized, disciplined, and almost invisible mechanism to enforce power and maintain loyalty. In the shadows of the city, the seeds of what would become Murder Incorporated were sown, an operation that combined efficiency, fear, and meticulous planning in ways that had never been seen before. The vision of this clandestine organization was both simple and chilling: a group of men whose singular purpose was the execution of contracts, the enforcement of discipline, and the protection of alliances. Unlike previous criminal operations, which often relied on improvisation and spectacle, Murder Incorporated functioned like a machine, precise and methodical, operating under a strict hierarchy. Anastasia quickly understood that success would depend on his ability to orchestrate this machinery from behind the scenes, to exercise influence without revealing vulnerability, and to instill a pervasive, almost intangible, sense of fear. Those who worked for him learned early that discretion was paramount, and that every action, no matter how small, was part of a broader, carefully constructed plan. Anastasia's leadership style within Murder Incorporated was defined by silent authority. He rarely spoke more than necessary, yet when he did, his words carried weight far beyond their measure. He cultivated a reputation for both fairness and ruthlessness: fair in the sense that those who performed their duties well were rewarded, and ruthless in the sense that any deviation from expectation could result in consequences that were swift, precise, and unforgettable. The paradox of his demeanor, calm, almost unremarkable, yet undeniably commanding, became a defining characteristic of the organization. Subordinates, allies, and even rivals could sense the subtle power of a man who trusted no one yet understood how to inspire absolute compliance. The men who made up Murder Incorporated were a reflection of Anastasia's own philosophy: disciplined, observant, and willing to execute their tasks without hesitation. They were recruited not merely for strength or reputation, but for reliability and discretion. Each operative understood the delicate balance between visibility and invisibility, each learned that the true power of the organization lay not in the noise of violence, but in its precision. Anastasia's approach was methodical, almost clinical, ensuring that every hit was calculated, every message sent, and every act of enforcement strategically positioned to maximize effect and minimize exposure. The underworld of New York had never seen such a combination of fear, efficiency, and subtlety, and the city itself became a silent witness to the growing reach of the organization. In orchestrating this empire of violence, Anastasia demonstrated a rare combination of strategic intelligence and psychological insight. He recognized that fear could be as powerful as loyalty, and that the perception of omnipotence often mattered more than its reality. Even minor acts were imbued with meaning: a well-timed warning, a calculated display of force, a carefully chosen target, all reinforced the aura of control. Anastasia understood the human psyche with a precision that few could rival, anticipating the reactions of both allies and adversaries, and ensuring that the influence of Murder Incorporated extended far beyond the immediate execution of contracts. The efficiency of Murder Incorporated also relied heavily on secrecy and compartmentalization. Anastasia was meticulous in ensuring that information flowed only where necessary, that knowledge of operations was tightly controlled, and that trust was extended sparingly. Every operative understood the hierarchy and the chain of command, and every action was part of a broader strategy that Anastasia alone fully comprehended. The organization operated like a well-oiled machine, each member performing their role with precision, aware that a single misstep could compromise not only the operation but also their own survival. It was a world in which trust was rare, observation was constant, and every detail, no matter how minor, could carry consequences of life or death. At the same time, Anastasia remained acutely aware of the external environment. The city's political landscape, the shifting alliances among rival gangs, and the occasional pressure from law enforcement all required vigilance. Anastasia's genius lay in his ability to integrate these external factors into the operations of Murder Incorporated, anticipating changes, adjusting strategies, and maintaining dominance even in the face of uncertainty. He understood that true power was not static, it required constant adaptation, and that survival depended on both foresight and the ability to project authority without exposing vulnerability. The creation of Murder Incorporated also represented a turning point in the perception of organized crime. Where once fear was often accompanied by spectacle, Anastasia's approach was almost surgical. The organization became known for its quiet efficiency, its ability to strike without warning, and the chilling implication that no action went unobserved. Stories of their operation spread through the underworld with a hushed reverence. A phone call, a meeting, or even a glance could carry the weight of impending consequence. Anastasia's influence grew not through flamboyance, but through this precise orchestration of fear and control, a psychological dominance that permeated every corner of New York's criminal landscape. Yet, even within this structure, Anastasia's personal philosophy remained clear: trust was rare, loyalty was earned, and observation was paramount. He maintained a careful distance from his subordinates, ensuring that no one could wield influence over him or compromise his authority. He understood that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, was always fragile, and that a single lapse in vigilance could unravel years of careful work. Every meeting, every decision, every allocation of responsibility was guided by a mind attuned to both opportunity and threat, a mind that had been shaped by the streets of Calabria, the docks of New York, and the early lessons of human behavior that had defined his youth. The emergence of Murder Incorporated under Anastasia's direction not only consolidated his power but also changed the very nature of organized crime in America. It was a model of efficiency, discipline, and psychological strategy, a silent engine of influence that extended far beyond the immediate acts of violence it executed. It was a structure in which fear and respect were intertwined, in which observation and calculation guided every decision, and in which the reputation of the leader, and the organization, was maintained through meticulous control of perception. Anastasia's rise was no longer a matter of chance, it was the product of deliberate, relentless strategy, a testament to a mind capable of navigating both human nature and the harsh realities of a city that never slept. In this period, Albert Anastasia transformed from a street-savvy survivor into a figure whose authority would eventually command fear and respect across the entire underworld. Murder Incorporated became the manifestation of his philosophy, a mechanism through which his vision of control, loyalty, and fear could be realized. The organization's operations were quiet yet powerful, invisible yet omnipresent, a reflection of the man at its helm. Through his leadership, Anastasia demonstrated that true power lay not in the visible display of dominance, but in the careful orchestration of action, the subtle cultivation of fear, and the meticulous management of perception. In this way, the Lord of Murder Incorporated solidified his position as one of the most formidable figures in the history of organized crime. By the time Albert Anastasia had firmly established his influence within Murder Incorporated, the city of New York had begun to feel like a chessboard, each neighborhood, alley, and dockside warehouse a potential square upon which power could be exercised or lost. Anastasia moved through this world with the precision of a grandmaster, aware that every action carried consequence and every omission could be exploited by those seeking advantage. His growing reputation as a man who trusted no one, yet whose commands were executed with unwavering precision, made him both respected and feared. There was an elegance in the way he balanced observation, patience, and action, a balance that few could challenge and fewer could understand. Anastasia's role was not limited to overseeing the enforcement arm of the organization, he became a strategist, a silent arbiter of influence who shaped alliances and neutralized threats before they fully materialized. He studied the behavior of rival gangs, the loyalties of associates, and the ebb and flow of the city's underworld with meticulous care. Every interaction, every whispered conversation, every subtle gesture was noted and catalogued in his mind. Anastasia understood that power in his world was as much psychological as it was physical, and that the perception of control could be as compelling as control itself. The mere suggestion of his presence was enough to make rivals reconsider their actions, a quiet intimidation that required no words. Within the hierarchy of organized crime, Anastasia's understanding of human nature became a formidable weapon. He observed how fear could enforce discipline more effectively than brutality, how loyalty could be cultivated through subtle rewards as much as through threats, and how a single well-timed act could consolidate authority across an entire network. Unlike those who relied on displays of raw aggression, Anastasia's strength lay in anticipation, calculation, and subtlety. The men who worked under him knew that their actions were being evaluated continuously, that missteps would be noticed, and that their fates depended on both competence and discretion. In this way, he built an organization in which efficiency, obedience, and fear were inextricably linked. Even as Murder Incorporated grew in power and influence, the city itself seemed to respond to Anastasia's methodical presence. Street corners, dockyards, and warehouses, all the arenas of the underworld, carried the subtle echoes of his influence. Men whispered his name with a mixture of awe and dread, often embellishing stories of his ruthlessness, yet always acknowledging the precision with which he operated. The psychological weight of his reputation extended beyond immediate acts of violence, it permeated the decision-making of associates, rivals, and even law enforcement. To encounter Anastasia in the underworld was to confront not only a man but the careful orchestration of fear and strategy that he embodied. Anastasia's rising power also drew attention from both allies and adversaries who sought to measure his influence against their own. In the delicate balance of the underworld, even the most subtle shift could provoke tension, spark rivalry, or demand negotiation. Anastasia understood that every alliance was fragile, every partnership temporary, and that the perception of loyalty could be as powerful as loyalty itself. He cultivated relationships with precision, maintaining just enough distance to command respect while keeping potential threats at arm's length. Those who earned his trust, or his tolerance, did so through consistent performance and discretion, and the consequences of failure were often swift and unambiguous. While Anastasia's reputation for meticulous control grew, so too did his understanding of the limitations of visibility. He learned that public displays of power could be dangerous, drawing attention from both law enforcement and rivals. Instead, he relied on subtlety, careful observation, and strategic influence to shape outcomes. Decisions were rarely made impulsively, timing, context, and the disposition of those involved were always taken into account. In this way, Anastasia transformed even ordinary interactions into calculated moves, ensuring that the momentum of his organization remained unchallenged. The psychological impact of his leadership style was profound. Subordinates internalized the idea that obedience was both necessary and inescapable, rivals hesitated in the presence of a reputation that seemed to anticipate their moves, and associates learned that efficiency and discretion were rewarded more reliably than boldness or arrogance. Anastasia's mastery of human behavior, coupled with the structural efficiency of Murder Incorporated, created a formidable synergy, a system in which fear and respect were intertwined, perception and reality aligned, and the flow of influence was carefully controlled. It was a structure that few could penetrate and even fewer could resist. Amid this rise, Anastasia also understood the importance of adaptability. The underworld was not static, it was a dynamic, shifting ecosystem of opportunity and threat. He anticipated changes in alliances, assessed the potential impact of rival actions, and adjusted strategies accordingly. This constant awareness of the environment allowed him to maintain dominance even when confronted with unforeseen challenges. For Anastasia, power was not merely seized, it was maintained through observation, foresight, and the careful orchestration of influence. In private, Anastasia remained as measured and disciplined as he was in public. Despite his growing authority, he maintained a rigorous attention to detail, documenting information mentally, analyzing scenarios, and planning contingencies. Even casual interactions became opportunities to assess loyalty, gauge intentions, and refine strategy. The combination of patience, intelligence, and subtle ruthlessness created an aura of inevitability around his decisions. To cross him was to invite consequences both immediate and long-lasting, and to serve him faithfully was to secure protection and opportunity within a world defined by uncertainty. Through these formative years of consolidation, Anastasia's reputation solidified into something almost mythic. Stories of his precise enforcement, strategic brilliance, and unwavering authority circulated quietly through the city, blending fact with speculation, yet always reinforcing the aura of control. Men who had once underestimated him came to recognize that his power was not merely physical, but psychological, not only a product of violence, but of strategy, observation, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the moves of others. By the time he reached the apex of his influence, Anastasia had become more than a man. He was a symbol, a quiet yet undeniable force whose presence alone shaped the behavior of all who encountered it. As the structure of Murder Incorporated strengthened under his direction, Anastasia's influence extended into every corner of New York's underworld. The organization's efficiency, discipline, and careful orchestration of fear created a network that operated with both precision and subtlety, a testament to his strategic vision. Every member, every alliance, every action reflected the careful planning and psychological insight that had defined Anastasia's rise. In this way, he transformed the chaotic streets of New York into a controlled environment, a city where his influence, though often invisible, was pervasive, formidable, and unchallenged. By the mid-1930s, Albert Anastasia had moved from the shadows of the city into a position of undeniable authority within Murder Incorporated, yet with power came a new and constant companion: paranoia. The underworld was a place of shifting alliances, concealed agendas, and silent threats, and Anastasia knew better than anyone that one moment of inattention could have catastrophic consequences. He had learned from Calabria and from his earliest mentors that trust was precious and fleeting, and that even those closest could harbor ambitions of betrayal. The constant awareness of danger, the need to anticipate treachery at every turn, became a defining feature of his life. Anastasia's careful surveillance extended not only to rivals but to his own men. He understood that fear alone was insufficient to maintain discipline. Loyalty had to be earned, monitored, and reinforced. He cultivated an atmosphere in which every action, every word, and every hesitation was meaningful. Subordinates learned to think twice before acting, to question the motives of others, and to recognize that Anastasia's presence, whether visible or unseen, was always influencing outcomes. This heightened attention to detail and control allowed him to anticipate challenges before they became threats, maintaining his authority through both strategy and psychological mastery. The paranoia, however, was not merely a personal trait, it was a strategic tool. Anastasia's vigilance ensured that he was always several steps ahead, anticipating the movements of rivals, law enforcement, and even his own associates. He understood that the perception of omniscience could amplify the influence of Murder Incorporated, creating an aura of inevitability around his decisions. Those who considered defiance often hesitated, not knowing whether resistance would be noticed, tolerated, or punished. The uncertainty itself became a weapon, shaping behavior through the subtle yet powerful influence of fear and respect. As the organization grew in power, so too did the complexity of its operations. Anastasia oversaw contracts that spanned multiple boroughs, coordinating men whose skills ranged from intimidation to execution, and ensuring that each operation adhered to the strict standards he demanded. He refined the processes by which targets were selected, approached, and eliminated, always emphasizing discretion, timing, and efficiency. To Anastasia, the elegance of a well-executed plan lay in its invisibility. When a task was completed with precision, no one outside the inner circle needed to know the full extent of planning, yet the message was unmistakably delivered. The city itself became a canvas upon which Anastasia painted with calculated strokes. He mapped the neighborhoods, the corridors of influence, and the territories controlled by rivals, creating mental grids that allowed him to navigate both opportunity and risk with remarkable acuity. He observed the comings and goings of law enforcement, noting patterns, schedules, and potential vulnerabilities. He studied the behavior of rival leaders, analyzing tendencies, weaknesses, and alliances that could be exploited or neutralized. The rhythm of the city, from the bustling docks to the quieter side streets, became an extension of his awareness, and he moved through it as a predator might, alert, measured, and precise. Anastasia's paranoia also extended to the larger landscape of organized crime. The rise of other syndicates, the ambitions of emerging figures, and the subtle encroachments of rivals all demanded careful attention. He anticipated potential challenges long before they emerged, adjusting strategies, reinforcing alliances, and positioning his organization to respond with efficiency. His ability to integrate multiple layers of observation, prediction, and execution created a system in which Murder Incorporated operated almost autonomously, yet always aligned with his strategic vision. The city's underworld became a network in which his presence was felt even in moments of absence, a reflection of both meticulous planning and psychological insight. This constant vigilance shaped not only his operational decisions but also his personal life. Anastasia maintained strict control over whom he associated with, whom he trusted, and the degree to which he revealed information. Even among family and close allies, boundaries were carefully maintained, ensuring that loyalty was never assumed and that every relationship was calibrated for influence and security. His private routines, interactions, and even the spaces he occupied were orchestrated with discretion in mind. This level of control reinforced the myth of Anastasia as a man whose awareness extended beyond the visible, a figure whose presence could be sensed even when he was not physically present. Despite the ever-present tension, Anastasia's calculated paranoia was never crippling, it was functional. It informed his decisions without overwhelming them, guiding strategy rather than constraining it. He understood that fear could be used both outwardly and inwardly, it disciplined his men, deterred rivals, and sharpened his own instincts. By embracing vigilance as a tool rather than a burden, he transformed what might have been a personal flaw into an operational advantage, reinforcing both the effectiveness of Murder Incorporated and the perception of his own infallibility. Within this climate of control and anticipation, Anastasia continued to expand the reach of Murder Incorporated, coordinating operations with an almost mechanical efficiency. Each action was deliberate, each decision weighed against multiple contingencies, and each outcome anticipated with foresight. The network of enforcers and associates functioned with precision, understanding that failure was not merely personal but potentially catastrophic for the entire organization. The psychological pressure Anastasia maintained ensured that efficiency was not only expected but internalized, creating an ecosystem in which loyalty, fear, and performance were intertwined seamlessly. Even as he maintained this iron grip, Anastasia's awareness of the fragility of power remained constant. He understood that law enforcement, rival factions, and even internal dissent could destabilize carefully constructed hierarchies. This awareness informed not only his operational strategies but also the cultivation of his personal aura. He moved quietly, spoke only when necessary, and ensured that his presence conveyed authority without overexposure. By doing so, he maintained both control and mystery, the dual pillars upon which his influence rested. Through this relentless attention to detail, Anastasia transformed paranoia into mastery. It was no longer simply fear of betrayal or failure, it had become a tool for anticipation, a mechanism for strategy, and a lens through which the world could be interpreted and managed. The streets, the neighborhoods, the allies, and the rivals were all part of an intricate system in which every action could be predicted, every outcome influenced, and every opportunity exploited. Anastasia's careful observation, combined with his disciplined execution, ensured that he remained several steps ahead, a silent yet omnipresent force in a city teeming with ambition and danger. In this way, the Lord of Murder Incorporated became not only a figure of fear but a master of influence, shaping outcomes before they occurred and maintaining dominance through a combination of anticipation, discipline, and psychological acuity. His paranoia, honed through decades of experience, had evolved into a strategic instrument, enabling him to navigate a world defined by uncertainty with a calm, measured, and almost inevitable authority. By embracing vigilance as both shield and sword, Anastasia ensured that his legacy would be defined not only by the acts he commanded but by the enduring presence of his mind and will in every corner of New York's criminal underworld. By the late 1930s, Albert Anastasia had firmly cemented his position within Murder Incorporated, yet the consolidation of power brought with it not only opportunity but an increasing complexity of threats. In a world defined by loyalty and betrayal, he had learned that influence was fragile, alliances were transient, and even the most trusted associates could conceal ambitions of their own. Anastasia's reputation for meticulous observation and precise enforcement had grown, and with it, both respect and wariness among his peers. He moved through the underworld with the awareness of a man who knew that every glance, every gesture, every whispered conversation could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. The balance of power was delicate. Rival factions in New York and beyond were constantly testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, and seeking opportunities to expand influence. Anastasia understood that the slightest miscalculation could spark conflict or embolden adversaries. To maintain dominance, he relied on a combination of strategic alliances, carefully orchestrated intimidation, and calculated demonstrations of authority. Each decision, each interaction, was carefully weighed for both immediate effect and long-term consequence. Through this disciplined approach, he ensured that the reach of Murder Incorporated extended far beyond the visible operations, creating an ecosystem of influence in which his control was felt even when he was not physically present. Anastasia's operational acumen was complemented by an unparalleled understanding of human psychology. He recognized that fear could be wielded as effectively as loyalty, and that perception often mattered more than reality. Stories of sudden, precise retribution circulated quietly through the city, reinforcing the notion that Anastasia's oversight was inescapable. Even rivals who had no direct contact with him internalized the understanding that actions had consequences, and that every misstep could invite a response calculated to both punish and send a message. In this way, Anastasia extended his influence not just through his immediate actions, but through the careful cultivation of reputation and anticipation of human behavior. While his rise was marked by operational precision, it was also shaped by the subtle art of diplomacy. Anastasia knew that absolute domination was rarely sustainable without careful management of relationships. Allies needed to feel valued, rivals needed to respect boundaries, and subordinates needed to internalize the consequences of obedience and failure. He cultivated an intricate network of communication, negotiation, and influence that allowed him to maintain stability even amid the inherent volatility of the underworld. In each interaction, Anastasia displayed an understanding of nuance, timing, and perception that few could match, ensuring that his authority remained both invisible and undeniable. At the same time, Anastasia was not immune to the pressures of scrutiny. Law enforcement agencies, increasingly aware of the operations of Murder Incorporated, were beginning to apply indirect pressure, investigating patterns, connections, and the occasional slip. Yet even in the face of scrutiny, Anastasia maintained a calm and calculated composure. He anticipated potential exposure, adjusted strategies, and ensured that operations were executed with precision that minimized risk. The combination of meticulous planning and psychological insight created a buffer against uncertainty, allowing him to navigate a landscape in which the stakes were as high as they had ever been. The men under Anastasia's command understood the dual nature of his authority. He inspired both respect and apprehension, blending discipline with an almost imperceptible form of psychological control. Orders were followed with exactitude not only because of fear, but because of an ingrained understanding of consequence. Mistakes were rarely tolerated, yet efficiency, discretion, and loyalty were rewarded. Anastasia's leadership created a culture in which the organization functioned as a cohesive, almost self-regulating entity, each operative internalizing the principles that guided behavior, anticipated reactions, and reinforced the perception of control. Even amidst the strategic orchestration of Murder Incorporated, Anastasia remained acutely aware of the fragility of power. Rival factions, ambitious associates, and unforeseen circumstances were ever-present risks. He recognized that the underworld was an ecosystem of constant flux, in which today's advantage could become tomorrow's vulnerability. To counter this, he invested immense attention into contingency planning, anticipating possible moves, preparing countermeasures, and maintaining the flexibility to respond swiftly and decisively. In this, his strategic paranoia became a powerful asset, shaping decisions, fortifying loyalty, and deterring potential challengers. The psychological weight of his position was considerable, yet Anastasia transformed vigilance into mastery. His attention to detail extended from organizational logistics to interpersonal dynamics, from operational security to reputation management. Every conversation, every meeting, and even casual encounters were opportunities to gather information, assess intentions, and reinforce influence. This relentless focus allowed him to maintain control over an increasingly complex organization, and to project power far beyond the visible reach of his actions. Through these years, Anastasia's reputation became something of a legend. Stories circulated of sudden, precise punishments, unexpected demonstrations of authority, and an almost omniscient awareness of activity within the criminal world. Even those who never encountered him directly felt the pressure of his influence, internalizing the understanding that deviation, disloyalty, or challenge would not go unnoticed. This reputation was reinforced by careful planning and strategic execution, a combination of tangible action and intangible perception that made Anastasia a figure both respected and feared across the city. Amid the consolidation of power, Anastasia also began to consider the broader implications of leadership and legacy. He understood that the survival of Murder Incorporated depended not only on the execution of contracts or the enforcement of discipline, but also on the careful cultivation of perception, the management of alliances, and the anticipation of change. His decisions reflected a deep awareness of both immediate and long-term consequence, blending operational rigor with strategic foresight. Through this approach, he ensured that the organization would continue to function effectively, even in his absence, and that his influence would endure far beyond the immediacy of any single action. In this period of consolidation, Albert Anastasia became more than a man, he became an embodiment of control, efficiency, and strategic foresight. The organization he led operated with a precision that mirrored his own disciplined mind, and the city itself seemed to bend subtly to the rhythms he had established. Allies, rivals, and subordinates all navigated a world shaped by his decisions, anticipating his strategies, and internalizing the consequences of his authority. Through meticulous planning, psychological insight, and unwavering vigilance, Anastasia secured not only his place in the underworld but the enduring legacy of a man whose reputation would inspire awe, fear, and respect for generations to come. By the early 1940s, Albert Anastasia had solidified his reputation as a figure whose presence was felt long before he appeared, a man whose influence extended across the city in ways both visible and invisible. Murder Incorporated had evolved under his guidance into an organization of remarkable efficiency, operating with precision, discretion, and an almost mechanical reliability. Yet, even as his authority grew, so too did the ever-present tension that accompanied power in the underworld. Anastasia understood better than most that prominence invited scrutiny, rivalry, and the subtle encroachments of ambition. The city, with all its chaotic rhythms and hidden corridors, remained both a stage and a testing ground for his mastery of control. Anastasia's approach to leadership had matured into a delicate balance of psychological acuity, calculated intimidation, and strategic foresight. He knew that raw aggression could be fleeting, but the projection of authority, when combined with discipline and observation, could create enduring influence. Subordinates learned to anticipate his expectations, rivals hesitated at the mere suggestion of his presence, and allies aligned their actions to the rhythms he set without ever feeling overt coercion. The result was a system in which compliance was both internalized and unavoidable, a subtle yet powerful testament to his understanding of human behavior and organizational dynamics. The operations under his watch became increasingly sophisticated. Contracts were executed with minimal exposure, messages were conveyed with precision, and the network of operatives functioned with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Anastasia's insistence on discretion ensured that the organization could act decisively while remaining largely invisible to the public eye. This invisibility was not accidental, it was cultivated with meticulous care, a reflection of his understanding that true power often resides not in spectacle but in the control of perception. Even the most influential figures in rival gangs could never be certain of his movements, and the uncertainty itself became a tool of authority. At the same time, Anastasia's vigilance extended beyond operational matters into the realm of interpersonal dynamics. He observed the subtleties of body language, the nuances of speech, and the patterns of behavior among both subordinates and adversaries. Every meeting, every casual conversation, and even the quietest exchange of information became a means of assessment. By reading intent, gauging loyalty, and anticipating potential threats, he was able to maintain a level of control that few could challenge. The psychological component of his leadership, combined with the structural efficiency of Murder Incorporated, ensured that authority was both maintained and reinforced in ways that transcended brute force. Despite the efficiency of his organization, Anastasia was never complacent. The underworld was fluid, alliances were fragile, and opportunity and threat were often intertwined. He constantly evaluated the balance of power, seeking to anticipate rival moves, reinforce key relationships, and mitigate emerging risks. This adaptability became a defining feature of his leadership, allowing him to maintain dominance even in the face of uncertainty. The city, with all its ever-shifting dynamics, became a canvas upon which he could exercise both foresight and influence, shaping outcomes before they fully materialized. Anastasia also understood the importance of cultivating both respect and fear. These dual forces were not contradictory in his mind, rather, they were complementary. Fear ensured obedience and deterred challenges, while respect reinforced loyalty and inspired confidence among those who served him. He balanced these elements with precision, ensuring that each operative understood the consequences of failure without feeling permanently alienated, and that each rival recognized the risks of defiance without overestimating their own power. In this careful orchestration, Anastasia created a psychological environment in which compliance was internalized and resistance was minimized. The mid-century years also brought subtle changes in the broader criminal landscape. Emerging figures sought to expand influence, law enforcement agencies increased indirect pressure, and the public perception of organized crime was slowly evolving. Anastasia adapted to these changes with the same calculated precision that had defined his rise. He adjusted strategies, reinforced key alliances, and ensured that Murder Incorporated could continue to operate with minimal exposure. Even as external pressures mounted, the organization maintained its efficiency, discretion, and cohesion, a testament to his foresight and leadership. In addition to operational mastery, Anastasia cultivated a careful personal aura. He was a man who rarely displayed emotion openly, whose gestures were minimal, and whose speech was deliberate. This calm, almost enigmatic presence contributed to his authority, making his actions and words carry weight far beyond their immediate content. Associates, rivals, and allies alike learned that the subtleties of interaction with Anastasia were as meaningful as overt commands, and that every encounter, however mundane it seemed, had layers of implication. This combination of personal discipline and psychological control reinforced the perception of his omnipresence and inevitability. Anastasia's mastery was not limited to immediate operational concerns, he also considered the broader structure and sustainability of his influence. He cultivated successors, reinforced loyalty among key lieutenants, and ensured that the systems he established would continue to function even in his absence. This strategic foresight was informed by his deep understanding of human behavior, organizational dynamics, and the fragile nature of power. Through careful planning, he created a framework in which Murder Incorporated could operate as an enduring mechanism of authority, while simultaneously reinforcing his personal reputation as a figure whose judgment and foresight were unmatched. By the early 1940s, Anastasia had become more than a leader, he had become a symbol. Stories of his precision, ruthlessness, and quiet authority spread through the criminal underworld, blending fact with perception, and creating an almost mythic image. Rivals spoke of him with caution, subordinates with reverence, and allies with respect. Yet even as this reputation grew, Anastasia maintained his vigilance, recognizing that perception alone was not sufficient, it had to be backed by continued observation, strategic action, and psychological acuity. In this delicate balance of image and reality, he maintained dominance over Murder Incorporated and over the broader networks of power in New York. Through these years, Albert Anastasia demonstrated that true authority is not merely the result of force or spectacle, but the combination of strategic vision, psychological insight, and relentless attention to detail. His ability to navigate a world defined by uncertainty, to anticipate threats before they arose, and to maintain the loyalty of those around him, ensured that his influence would be enduring. In the quiet streets, the bustling docks, and the shadowed alleys of New York, his presence was a constant, shaping behavior. Reinforcing authority, and demonstrating that mastery in the underworld required not only power, but patience, foresight, and unwavering vigilance. As the 1940s progressed, Albert Anastasia's influence within the underworld grew ever more absolute, yet the landscape of organized crime remained a terrain of constant volatility. Allies could shift alliances on a whisper, rivals could exploit even the smallest lapse, and the law itself, though often a distant observer, could suddenly tighten its reach. Anastasia understood that power was a dynamic force, never static, and that maintaining dominance required constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and an almost obsessive awareness of human behavior. Each decision he made, each interaction he engaged in, was measured against the potential for both immediate gain and long-term consequence. Within Murder Incorporated, Anastasia cultivated an intricate system of control that balanced fear, respect, and loyalty. The operatives under his command learned early that deviation from the plan carried consequences that were swift and uncompromising, yet their efficiency and discretion were quietly rewarded. The balance between punishment and reward created a psychological rhythm in which compliance became internalized rather than merely imposed. Anastasia's genius lay in this subtle orchestration. He did not simply command, he influenced, anticipated, and manipulated outcomes in ways that appeared effortless yet were meticulously calculated. Even as he wielded power over Murder Incorporated, Anastasia recognized that external perception was equally crucial. His reputation had begun to transcend the immediate operations of the organization, becoming a form of influence in itself. Rivals hesitated not merely because of fear of direct retaliation, but because of the almost mythic aura surrounding his persona. Stories circulated quietly through the city, some accurate, others exaggerated, of sudden acts of precision, unflinching enforcement, and an almost omniscient awareness of events. The very uncertainty amplified his authority, creating a psychological dominance that extended far beyond the reach of any single action. This period also highlighted Anastasia's understanding of alliances and negotiation. Power, he knew, was rarely exercised in isolation. Each faction, each associate, each potential rival represented both a risk and an opportunity. Anastasia maintained relationships with measured detachment, extending trust only where it served strategic purposes and always observing for signs of betrayal or ambition. He was patient, allowing events to unfold while maintaining an overarching awareness of the shifting dynamics around him. The subtlety of this approach ensured that he could manipulate outcomes without appearing overtly manipulative, reinforcing his reputation as both a strategist and a master of perception. Anastasia's vigilance extended even to seemingly minor details. A conversation overheard in a hallway, a hesitant glance, or a subtle hesitation during a meeting could signal potential threats or opportunities. He catalogued these observations meticulously, interpreting behavior with the precision of a seasoned analyst. In this way, he maintained a level of situational awareness that few could match, ensuring that decisions were informed by both fact and intuition. Every choice, whether in the planning of an operation or the management of relationships, was made with a profound understanding of consequence, reinforcing the structure of control he had built within Murder Incorporated. As the reach of the organization expanded, so too did the complexity of its operations. Anastasia oversaw multiple contracts simultaneously, coordinating the actions of men whose skills ranged from strategic enforcement to discreet intimidation. The careful orchestration of these operations required not only logistical oversight but psychological insight, ensuring that each operative understood both the immediate task and its broader implications. Discretion was paramount, a single misstep could jeopardize an entire chain of operations, yet when executed flawlessly, the results reinforced Anastasia's dominance while maintaining the organization's invisibility. The mid-century underworld demanded adaptability, and Anastasia exemplified this principle. He adjusted strategies in response to rival maneuvers, changes in law enforcement focus, and the evolving internal dynamics of his organization. He anticipated the ripple effects of every action, understanding that small decisions could cascade into far-reaching consequences. This strategic foresight was coupled with an acute awareness of timing. He knew that when to act was often as important as how to act. By mastering both calculation and timing, Anastasia ensured that Murder Incorporated remained a step ahead in a world defined by uncertainty and constant flux. Anastasia's leadership style also reflected a nuanced understanding of human psychology. He knew that fear alone could enforce compliance temporarily, but respect and loyalty were necessary for long-term stability. He balanced these forces with precision, ensuring that operatives internalized both the consequences of failure and the rewards of discipline. This balance created a self-reinforcing culture within Murder Incorporated, in which efficiency, loyalty, and discretion became the natural rhythm of daily operations. Through this approach, Anastasia maintained control without the need for constant supervision, a testament to his strategic foresight and understanding of human nature. Even amidst the growing success of Murder Incorporated, Anastasia remained acutely aware of the fragility of his position. Rivals constantly probed for weaknesses, ambitious subordinates weighed their options, and the attention of law enforcement was never far away. He cultivated contingency plans, prepared for multiple scenarios, and ensured that operational redundancies were in place. This meticulous planning extended beyond mere logistics. It encompassed alliances, rivalries, and the subtle influence of perception itself. Anastasia understood that control was not merely the absence of opposition but the proactive management of potential disruptions, and he executed this principle with precision. The psychological weight of these responsibilities was immense, yet Anastasia transformed it into mastery. His vigilance, once a product of paranoia, became an instrument of influence, allowing him to anticipate events, shape behavior, and maintain authority across a complex network of relationships. Each interaction, each observation, each strategic decision reinforced the perception of omniscience, further cementing his reputation and influence. By embracing both the challenges and responsibilities of leadership, Anastasia created an enduring system of control that extended beyond his immediate actions, ensuring that his authority would persist even in his absence. During this era, the city itself seemed to respond to Anastasia's presence. Neighborhoods, dockyards, and the hidden corridors of the underworld carried subtle echoes of his influence, as if the rhythm of his awareness had permeated the very fabric of daily life. Rivals moved cautiously, allies acted with precision, and even casual observers could sense the quiet authority that emanated from the man at the helm of Murder Incorporated. His power was simultaneously invisible and absolute, a testament to the combination of strategy, discipline, and psychological acuity that had defined his rise. By the late 1940s, Albert Anastasia had become more than a criminal leader, he had become a figure of mythic presence. His careful orchestration of Murder Incorporated, his mastery of perception, and his understanding of human nature ensured that his influence extended across the city in ways both subtle and profound. He was a man whose vigilance had evolved into strategy, whose paranoia had transformed into foresight, and whose authority had become a quiet yet undeniable force. In every corner of New York's underworld, the legacy of his control and the precision of his methods were deeply felt, laying the foundation for a reputation that would endure long after the immediate events of his life. By the late 1940s, the city of New York had become an intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and silent threats, and Albert Anastasia had firmly positioned himself at the center of it all. His reputation as a man who trusted no one yet commanded absolute obedience had only grown, and with it, the careful orchestration of Murder Incorporated reached new heights. Anastasia understood that influence was both fragile and powerful, that perception often outweighed reality, and that the underworld thrived on uncertainty and subtlety. Every step he took, every decision he made, was designed to maintain dominance, reinforce loyalty, and instill a quiet, pervasive sense of fear. The structure of Murder Incorporated had evolved into a highly efficient network, a system where discipline, discretion, and precision were internalized rather than externally imposed. Each operative understood their role, the consequences of failure, and the rewards of obedience. Anastasia's genius lay not only in his ability to command but in his capacity to anticipate human behavior, to interpret subtle cues, and to integrate these insights into his strategic vision. The city became his chessboard, and he, the master strategist, moved pieces with calculated purpose, knowing that even a single misstep could disrupt the balance of power he had so carefully cultivated. Anastasia's authority extended beyond the immediate operations of Murder Incorporated into the broader psychological landscape of the underworld. Rivals and allies alike internalized the knowledge that deviation, disloyalty, or miscalculation could provoke consequences both precise and unavoidable. Stories of sudden punishment and exacting enforcement circulated quietly, reinforcing the perception of his omnipresence. Yet this influence was exercised with subtlety. It was rarely flamboyant, often unseen, and always effective. The uncertainty it generated became a tool, compelling obedience and respect without overt displays of power. Strategic foresight had become the cornerstone of Anastasia's leadership. He constantly assessed potential threats, anticipated rival maneuvers, and adjusted alliances to maintain equilibrium. Power, he knew, was never static, and even the most loyal associates could be swayed by opportunity or ambition. He cultivated relationships with care, extending trust selectively and observing continuously for signs of disloyalty. In this environment, where perception often outweighed reality, Anastasia's meticulous observation and subtle manipulation of human behavior created a network of influence that was as resilient as it was pervasive. At the same time, Anastasia maintained strict control over his personal image. He rarely displayed emotion openly, spoke deliberately, and allowed silence to carry weight. This disciplined presence enhanced his authority, making even mundane interactions laden with significance. Associates, rivals, and allies alike learned that every conversation, every glance, and every gesture could carry meaning. Anastasia's understanding of perception allowed him to extend influence without direct action, a mastery of psychological control that ensured his dominance remained unchallenged. The operational sophistication of Murder Incorporated under Anastasia's leadership was remarkable. Contracts were executed with precision, messages were conveyed subtly yet unmistakably, and operatives functioned with the reliability of a well-calibrated mechanism. Each action was guided by meticulous planning, ensuring that the organization could exert power effectively while remaining largely invisible. Anastasia understood that discretion amplified influence. When actions were unseen yet consequences were certain, authority became both undeniable and enduring. Even rivals who never faced him directly felt the weight of his presence, navigating their own decisions with caution. Adaptability remained essential. Anastasia was acutely aware that the underworld was a fluid environment, shaped by ambition, circumstance, and external pressures. He adjusted strategies in real time, reinforced key alliances, and positioned Murder Incorporated to respond efficiently to unexpected developments. His foresight extended to the behavior of law enforcement, rival factions, and even seemingly minor figures whose actions could ripple through the criminal ecosystem. By integrating observation, prediction, and strategy, Anastasia maintained dominance while minimizing risk, ensuring that the organization's influence continued to grow quietly yet inexorably. Psychology, as much as logistics, defined Anastasia's control. Fear alone could enforce obedience temporarily, but respect and loyalty were necessary for the long-term stability of Murder Incorporated. He cultivated a careful balance, rewarding competence and discretion while punishing failure with precision. Subordinates internalized these expectations, creating a self-reinforcing culture in which efficiency and loyalty were natural, not coerced. This subtle orchestration of human behavior allowed Anastasia to maintain control over a sprawling network without the constant need for direct supervision. The influence of Anastasia extended into the city itself. New York streets, neighborhoods, and hidden corners seemed to resonate with the quiet authority of murder. Incorporated allies acted with precision, rivals hesitated in calculation, and the hum of activity often reflected the ripple effects of decisions made long before they became visible. Anastasia's presence was simultaneously invisible and absolute, a testament to the combination of discipline, foresight, and psychological mastery that had defined his career. The perception of omniscience became as powerful as any physical action, reinforcing his reputation across the criminal landscape. As his reach solidified, Anastasia began to consider legacy with greater attention. He sought to ensure that the systems he had constructed would endure, that successors could maintain operational efficiency, and that the influence of Murder Incorporated would persist even if he were absent. He trained key lieutenants with the same attention to detail that guided his own actions, emphasizing both operational competence and the subtleties of influence. By embedding these principles deeply within the organization, Anastasia ensured that his authority, and the mechanisms that supported it, would continue to shape the underworld long after any single contract or action. Through this careful orchestration, Anastasia became more than a figure of authority, he became a symbol. His influence was psychological, structural, and operational, extending far beyond what could be directly observed. Rivals and allies alike were bound by the perception of his presence, and even the casual observer of the underworld sensed the quiet yet formidable power he wielded. Anastasia's mastery lay not only in the actions he commanded but in the anticipation, calculation, and subtlety with which he operated. The city itself became a stage for his influence, a testament to the enduring impact of his leadership, strategy, and discipline. In these years, Albert Anastasia demonstrated that true power was a combination of perception, foresight, and control. His ability to maintain order in a chaotic environment, anticipate threats before they emerged, and cultivate loyalty while managing fear ensured that Murder Incorporated operated with unmatched precision. Each action, each decision, and each observation reinforced a network of influence that extended far beyond immediate operations, creating a legacy of authority that was both pervasive and enduring. Anastasia's mastery of strategy, psychology, and organizational control solidified his place as one of the most formidable figures in the history of organized crime, a presence that would shape the underworld for decades to come. By the early 1950s, Albert Anastasia had reached the pinnacle of his influence, a position forged through decades of careful observation, strategic action, and relentless attention to the subtleties of human behavior. Murder Incorporated had become more than a network of enforcers, it was a disciplined, almost autonomous system in which fear, loyalty, and efficiency intertwined seamlessly. Anastasia's ability to command respect and instill apprehension was now fully realized, and the city seemed to bend subtly to the rhythms he set. Yet even as his power solidified, the underworld remained a landscape of uncertainty, and the very prominence that had brought him authority also attracted the scrutiny of rivals and the law. Anastasia's daily life had become a careful balance of strategy and discretion. His attention to detail extended to every aspect of the organization, from the planning of contracts to the selection of operatives, and even the management of relationships with allies and potential rivals. He understood that leadership was not a static condition but an ongoing process, requiring constant adaptation to the shifting currents of ambition, opportunity, and risk. Each decision, no matter how small, was weighed against its potential consequences, and each action was calibrated to reinforce the perception of omniscience that had become central to his authority. The efficiency of Murder Incorporated was inextricably linked to Anastasia's meticulous oversight. Operatives executed contracts with a precision that reflected both training and the internalization of expectations. Loyalty was cultivated not merely through fear but through subtle reinforcement, rewarding discretion, competence, and obedience. Mistakes were not tolerated lightly, yet success was acknowledged in ways that strengthened allegiance and reinforced the operational culture. The organization functioned as a living system, with Anastasia's strategic mind at its center, guiding, correcting, and anticipating the next move in a complex game whose stakes were measured in both lives and influence. Anastasia's rise had also brought him into contact with a wider network of criminal and legitimate figures, each interaction an opportunity to consolidate power, manage perception, or neutralize potential threats. He maintained a careful balance between visibility and discretion, allowing his presence to be felt without overt display. This cultivated a mystique that extended beyond immediate operations, reinforcing his reputation as a man whose influence could not easily be measured or challenged. Stories of sudden retribution, meticulous planning, and near-omniscient awareness circulated quietly, amplifying his psychological control even among those who never faced him directly. Despite the outward calm of his demeanor, Anastasia remained constantly vigilant. The underworld, he knew, was never static. Alliances could shift, rivals could emerge, and even trusted associates could harbor ambitions of betrayal. He monitored these dynamics with patience and precision, assessing motivations, observing behaviors, and anticipating moves before they were made. Every gesture, every conversation, and every subtle hint of hesitation was catalogued in his mind, informing decisions and guiding strategy. His vigilance was not paranoia alone, it was a tool, a means of maintaining control and ensuring that the intricate network he had built continued to function with efficiency and precision. Anastasia's understanding of human nature became a strategic weapon. He knew that fear alone could command obedience but could not secure lasting loyalty. Respect and calculated reward reinforced compliance, creating a culture in which efficiency and discretion became ingrained habits rather than imposed rules. This balance of intimidation and reinforcement ensured that Murder Incorporated could operate smoothly, even when faced with unexpected challenges, and that the perception of control extended far beyond the immediate reach of Anastasia himself. Subordinates internalized the rhythms of expectation, while rivals learned to anticipate consequences without direct confrontation. The strategic dimension of Anastasia's influence was further evident in his handling of rival factions. Power in the underworld was never absolute, and the careful management of competition was essential. Anastasia maintained a network of alliances, negotiated settlements, and deployed subtle threats to keep potential challengers in check. By anticipating moves, preparing contingencies, and leveraging both perception and action, he created a system in which rival ambitions were constrained, and his own authority remained uncontested. Even minor disruptions were addressed swiftly and decisively, reinforcing the notion that Anastasia's oversight was inescapable. At the same time, Anastasia's personal discipline contributed to the effectiveness of his leadership. He maintained control over his schedule, interactions, and environment, ensuring that his mind remained focused and that decisions were made with clarity and foresight. Casual meetings, seemingly trivial observations, and quiet moments of reflection all became opportunities to reinforce strategy, assess loyalty, and anticipate threats. This rigorous attention to detail allowed him to operate with a calm precision that masked the complexity and tension underlying each decision. In this, the mastery of daily life became a reflection of the mastery he exercised over Murder Incorporated and the underworld at large. The city itself seemed to respond to Anastasia's presence. Streets, docks, warehouses, and neighborhoods carried the invisible imprint of his influence. Men moved with caution, decisions were tempered by awareness of consequences, and the rhythm of the underworld seemed orchestrated according to patterns only he fully understood. The psychological weight of his reputation extended beyond immediate operations, shaping the behavior of rivals, allies, and subordinates alike. Anastasia's authority was both structural and symbolic, a constant undercurrent that reinforced compliance and deterred defiance without the need for overt action. This era also saw the consolidation of power into a legacy that extended beyond immediate control. Anastasia began to cultivate the next layer of leadership within Murder Incorporated, ensuring that operational knowledge, strategic insight, and loyalty were embedded in key lieutenants. He recognized that the endurance of influence depended not solely on his presence but on the sustainability of the systems he had created. Training, observation, and reinforcement of operational and psychological principles became a cornerstone of his approach, guaranteeing that the organization would continue to function effectively even in the absence of its leader. Through these years, Albert Anastasia's combination of foresight, discipline, and psychological mastery established him as more than a criminal leader. He became a symbol of calculated authority. Fear, respect, and anticipation were woven together into a tapestry of influence that extended across the city, shaping behavior, reinforcing loyalty, and constraining ambition. His presence was omnipresent yet unobtrusive, a force that guided decisions, controlled outcomes, and ensured that the mechanisms of power he had designed operated with relentless efficiency. By the mid-1950s, Anastasia's legacy was secure not only in fact but in perception. Rivals regarded him with caution, subordinates with careful respect, and even casual observers of the underworld could sense the quiet authority that emanated from Murder Incorporated. He had mastered the delicate interplay between action and perception, control and influence, fear and loyalty. The city's criminal landscape had become, in many ways, an extension of his strategic vision, and the systems he had constructed ensured that his influence would persist, shaping outcomes long after the immediate contracts, confrontations, and alliances of the day. In these years, Anastasia demonstrated that power in the underworld was not merely a matter of force, but a combination of foresight, discipline, and mastery over human behavior. His ability to navigate the uncertainties of the criminal ecosystem, maintain loyalty, and anticipate threats ensured that Murder Incorporated operated with efficiency, discretion, and precision. Every action reinforced the perception of control, every decision reinforced authority, and every subtle movement contributed to a legacy that was as enduring as it was formidable. By the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia's influence had reached a scale few could imagine, stretching across the underworld with an efficiency that seemed almost invisible to outsiders. Murder Incorporated, under his guidance, operated like a finely tuned instrument, its actions precise, disciplined, and deliberate. Yet the very power that had elevated him also brought with it an intricate web of dangers. Rivals, ambitious lieutenants, and even law enforcement agencies moved carefully in his orbit, probing for weaknesses, testing loyalties, and seeking opportunities to challenge the authority that Anastasia had so carefully constructed. In this climate, vigilance was not a choice but a necessity, and Anastasia had honed it into an art form. His approach to leadership had evolved into a delicate combination of foresight, observation, and psychological acuity. He understood that influence extended beyond direct action, it resided in the perception of authority, the subtle manipulation of expectation, and the careful orchestration of behavior. Subordinates internalized the rhythms of discipline, loyalty, and discretion, allowing the organization to function efficiently even in his absence. Rivals were deterred not only by the knowledge of past consequences but by the anticipation of what he might do next. Anastasia had transformed vigilance into a tool of psychological mastery, using it to shape behavior, reinforce authority, and maintain dominance across a sprawling network of operatives and affiliates. The operational sophistication of Murder Incorporated during this period was remarkable. Contracts were executed with a precision that left little room for error, messages were delivered subtly but unmistakably, and the network of operatives functioned with the reliability of a well-coordinated mechanism. Anastasia's insistence on discretion ensured that actions remained largely invisible, while their effects resonated with clarity. The perception of omnipresence became as crucial as the physical execution of tasks. Fear and respect were cultivated not through spectacle but through an almost imperceptible demonstration of control. Even the most ambitious rivals hesitated, uncertain when, how, or if Anastasia might intervene. This era also highlighted the complexity of alliances and rivalries. Power in the underworld was rarely absolute, and maintaining dominance required constant assessment of shifting dynamics. Anastasia cultivated relationships with precision, extending trust selectively and observing for signs of ambition or disloyalty. Negotiations, subtle threats, and carefully timed demonstrations of influence became the tools through which he maintained equilibrium. Even seemingly minor interactions carried significance, as each could alter the perception of authority or shift the balance of loyalty. In this environment, Anastasia's mastery of human behavior and organizational dynamics was as critical as any operational strategy. The city itself seemed to respond to Anastasia's presence. The quiet rhythm of the streets, the bustling docks, and the hidden corridors of the underworld all reflected the subtle influence of his leadership. Operatives acted with precision, rivals moved cautiously, and even casual observers sensed a weight that was felt rather than seen. Anastasia's authority extended beyond immediate operations. It was structural, psychological, and pervasive, influencing behavior across layers of the underworld without the need for overt action. In this way, power became both tangible and abstract, a force that shaped the environment while remaining largely unseen. Despite the outward calm, Anastasia remained acutely aware of the fragility of his position. Rival factions probed for weaknesses, ambitious subordinates considered their options, and the attention of law enforcement was a constant variable in an unpredictable equation. He prepared contingencies, anticipated rival moves, and ensured that operational redundancies were in place. This meticulous planning extended beyond the immediate logistics of contracts and enforcement. It encompassed alliances, rivalries, and the subtle management of perception itself. Anastasia understood that authority was not simply the absence of opposition but the proactive control of potential disruptions, and he executed this principle with unwavering precision. The psychological dimension of Anastasia's control was as important as the physical execution of operations. He knew that fear could compel obedience, but respect and internalized loyalty ensured the stability of Murder Incorporated over time. Mistakes were met with swift correction, yet competence, discretion, and efficiency were quietly rewarded, reinforcing a culture in which the principles of obedience and subtlety became second nature. Subordinates internalized these expectations, creating a self-regulating system in which the organization functioned with remarkable cohesion. Through this blend of fear, respect, and anticipation, Anastasia's influence extended far beyond immediate command. Anastasia's personal discipline remained central to his effectiveness. He maintained careful control over his environment, interactions, and routines, ensuring that decisions were made with clarity and foresight. Casual observations, quiet moments of reflection, and the smallest details of daily life were opportunities to reinforce strategy, assess loyalty, and anticipate threats. This rigorous attention to both micro and macro dynamics allowed him to operate with calm precision, masking the complexity and tension underlying each action. In essence, the mastery of his personal routine mirrored the mastery he exercised over Murder Incorporated and the broader underworld. Even as his dominance grew, Anastasia never allowed complacency. He understood that influence could erode quickly if vigilance faltered, and that perception could be as fragile as it was powerful. He continued to assess, observe, and adapt, integrating intelligence, strategy, and foresight into every decision. This adaptability was crucial not only for survival but for maintaining the aura of omnipresence that had become a cornerstone of his authority. Each operation, each subtle gesture, and each relationship was managed to ensure both immediate effectiveness and long-term stability. By this time, Anastasia's reputation had become legendary, blending fact with perception to create an almost mythic presence in the criminal world. Stories of precise enforcement, sudden punishment, and unparalleled awareness circulated quietly, amplifying both fear and respect. Rivals and subordinates alike internalized the knowledge that deviation or defiance could provoke consequences that were not only certain but strategically orchestrated. Anastasia's ability to manipulate perception, maintain control, and anticipate human behavior had transformed him into a symbol of authority whose influence extended beyond the physical actions of Murder Incorporated. This period also marked a turning point in Anastasia's consideration of legacy. He began to focus more intentionally on ensuring that the systems he had established would endure, that lieutenants could maintain operational and strategic standards, and that the influence of Murder Incorporated would persist beyond the immediate contracts and confrontations of daily life. Training, reinforcement, and the cultivation of psychological acuity among key operatives became essential components of this strategy. By embedding his principles deeply into the organization, Anastasia ensured the continuation of both operational efficiency and his personal authority. Through the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia had become more than a figure of power, he had become a master of influence, perception, and strategy. Fear, respect, and loyalty intertwined seamlessly under his guidance, creating an organization capable of operating efficiently, discreetly, and effectively across a complex and ever-changing landscape. His presence, while often unseen, was deeply felt, shaping behavior, managing risk, and ensuring that the rhythms of the underworld moved in accordance with his vision. The combination of foresight, discipline, and psychological mastery established a legacy that was both enduring and formidable, a quiet but undeniable force in the city's criminal history. By the late 1950s, Albert Anastasia had fully consolidated his power, a figure whose influence extended through the dark veins of New York's underworld with a precision few could rival. Murder Incorporated, now an organization of seasoned operatives, functioned with discipline, discretion, and an almost mechanical efficiency. Yet, even in this period of dominance, the ever-present shadows of ambition, rivalry, and law enforcement scrutiny loomed. Anastasia understood that power was never static, that every triumph brought with it a new set of challenges, and that the very prominence which secured obedience could also attract betrayal. His vigilance, honed over decades, became both a shield and a tool, allowing him to anticipate, manipulate, and respond before potential threats could fully manifest. Anastasia's operational approach combined meticulous planning with subtle psychological influence. He recognized that authority extended beyond the execution of contracts or the enforcement of discipline; it resided in the perception of control, the anticipation of behavior, and the careful orchestration of both fear and respect. His subordinates internalized these rhythms, creating a culture in which efficiency and loyalty were instinctual. Mistakes were not simply punished, they were lessons that reinforced the framework of obedience. Competence and discretion, on the other hand, were quietly rewarded, reinforcing the understanding that every action had consequence and every behavior was observed. The sophistication of Murder Incorporated's operations during this time reflected Anastasia's strategic mind. Multiple contracts, complex assignments, and the coordination of operatives across different territories required oversight that was both comprehensive and subtle. Each operation was executed with precision, ensuring minimal exposure while maximizing impact. Yet Anastasia's true genius lay not only in the mechanics of execution but in his ability to manage perception. Fear and respect were cultivated not through spectacle but through the quiet certainty that any deviation or challenge would be met with a response as inevitable as it was precise. Even the boldest rivals hesitated, unsure when or how Anastasia might assert control. The mid-century underworld demanded constant adaptation, and Anastasia's foresight allowed him to navigate these shifts with remarkable ease. He monitored alliances, assessed emerging rivalries, and anticipated the ambitions of subordinates. By maintaining this constant vigilance, he was able to preempt challenges before they escalated into crises. Each decision, no matter how minor, was weighed against its potential consequences, and every action was designed to reinforce both immediate authority and long-term stability. In Anastasia's world, control was not merely maintained through enforcement, it was cultivated, observed, and reinforced continuously. Psychology played an essential role in this orchestration of power. Anastasia understood that fear alone could compel obedience but could not ensure loyalty or stability. Respect, discretion, and the internalization of expectations were equally crucial. Operatives learned to anticipate consequences, to navigate subtle cues, and to align their actions with the unspoken rhythms of authority that Anastasia had established. In this environment, efficiency, compliance, and loyalty became self-reinforcing, allowing the organization to operate smoothly even when direct supervision was minimal. The psychological architecture of control was as critical as the logistical mechanisms that executed contracts and enforced discipline. Anastasia's influence extended beyond immediate operations into the broader fabric of New York's criminal world. Streets, neighborhoods, docks, and backrooms all carried echoes of his authority. Allies acted with care, rivals calculated every move, and the broader perception of Murder Incorporated's reach reinforced compliance without the need for overt action. The city itself seemed to bend subtly to the rhythms of his control, a reflection of the enduring influence he wielded both structurally and psychologically. Even casual observers sensed a weight that was not always visible but always present, shaping behavior and expectations across layers of the underworld. Amidst the consolidation of power, Anastasia remained acutely aware of the fragility inherent in prominence. Ambitious lieutenants, rival factions, and law enforcement scrutiny were constants, each requiring careful management. Contingency planning became a crucial aspect of leadership, potential disruptions were anticipated, and strategies were prepared for multiple scenarios. Anastasia's approach combined observation, calculation, and timing, ensuring that each decision reinforced authority and minimized risk. In this environment, vigilance became a tool of mastery, allowing him to maintain control over both men and the broader currents of influence that flowed through the city. The psychological subtlety of his control became increasingly apparent during this era. He understood that power manifested not only through direct enforcement but through the anticipation of behavior, the orchestration of perception, and the quiet shaping of choices. Subordinates internalized the principles of efficiency, loyalty, and discretion, and even rivals adjusted their ambitions in response to the invisible weight of his presence. The perception of omnipresence, carefully cultivated and reinforced through both action and subtle suggestion, became one of Anastasia's most potent instruments, allowing him to maintain influence far beyond the scope of immediate operations. Anastasia's personal discipline mirrored the precision of his organization. He maintained careful control over his schedule, interactions, and routines, ensuring that his mind remained focused and capable of analyzing both immediate and long-term challenges. Every observation, every reflection, and even the smallest details of daily life became opportunities to reinforce strategy, assess loyalty, and anticipate potential threats. This personal mastery allowed him to operate with calm precision, projecting an aura of control that extended seamlessly into the operations of Murder Incorporated and the broader underworld network. During this period, the mythos surrounding Anastasia became as important as the reality of his actions. Stories of sudden retribution, exacting enforcement, and strategic foresight circulated quietly, reinforcing both fear and respect. The line between legend and reality blurred, amplifying his authority even among those who had never encountered him directly. In the criminal world, perception was as potent as force, and Anastasia had mastered the art of shaping it. The reputation he cultivated became a self-reinforcing mechanism, guiding behavior, deterring challenges, and ensuring that his influence extended far beyond immediate operations. By the end of the 1950s, Albert Anastasia had become not only a figure of power but a symbol of calculated authority. His mastery of strategy, psychology, and organizational control ensured that Murder Incorporated operated with efficiency, discretion, and resilience. Fear, respect, and loyalty were intricately woven into the fabric of the organization, and the city itself seemed to bend subtly to the rhythms he had established. Anastasia's influence was both tangible and abstract, immediate and enduring, a reflection of decades of disciplined observation, strategic foresight, and psychological acuity. Through this period, Anastasia demonstrated that true authority in the underworld was never a matter of brute force alone. It was the careful blending of foresight, discipline, perception, and psychological mastery, a delicate orchestration of power that ensured both survival and dominance. Each decision, each observation, and each action reinforced an intricate network of influence, creating a legacy that would endure long after the fleeting events of any single day. In this way, Anastasia had transformed vigilance into mastery, paranoia into strategy, and authority into an almost invisible yet unassailable force within the heart of New York's criminal world. By the early 1960s, Albert Anastasia had become a figure whose presence was felt even when unseen, a man whose influence stretched across New York's underworld like an invisible web. The operations of Murder Incorporated had matured into a finely tuned system, where fear, loyalty, and efficiency intertwined seamlessly. Yet even at the height of his power, Anastasia understood that dominance was inherently fragile, and that complacency could be fatal. The city's streets, alleys, docks, and hidden rooms were filled with ambition, intrigue, and danger, and he navigated them with the same meticulous care and foresight that had defined his rise. Each day required observation, calculation, and the quiet orchestration of human behavior, ensuring that his authority remained unchallenged. Anastasia's approach to leadership had evolved into an almost artful practice of psychological and strategic mastery. He recognized that authority was not merely exercised through direct action, but through anticipation, perception, and subtle influence. Subordinates learned to act with precision, understanding both the explicit and implicit expectations imposed upon them. Deviations were met with swift, precise consequences, while discretion, efficiency, and loyalty were rewarded in subtle ways that reinforced compliance without overt demonstration. Through this careful balance, Anastasia maintained the cohesion of Murder Incorporated, ensuring that the organization functioned with reliability even in his absence. The operational complexity of Murder Incorporated required extraordinary coordination. Contracts were meticulously planned and executed, operatives were positioned with exacting attention to detail, and each step was calculated to minimize exposure while maximizing impact. Anastasia's oversight extended to both the immediate mechanics of each operation and the broader strategic picture, ensuring that actions aligned with long-term objectives. His genius lay not only in the flawless execution of plans but in his ability to manage perception. Fear and respect were cultivated quietly, and even rivals hesitated before testing boundaries. The invisible weight of his presence shaped decisions far beyond the reach of direct enforcement. Anastasia was acutely aware that the underworld was a constantly shifting environment. Rival factions sought opportunities, ambitious lieutenants contemplated advancement, and the scrutiny of law enforcement was an ever-present variable. To navigate these uncertainties, Anastasia maintained a continuous process of observation and adaptation. He monitored alliances, assessed threats, and anticipated challenges before they fully materialized. His actions were informed by both careful analysis and an intuitive understanding of human behavior, allowing him to remain a step ahead of competitors and to reinforce the perception of omnipotence that had become central to his authority. Psychology was as central to Anastasia's control as logistics. He understood that fear could enforce obedience in the short term, but respect and internalized loyalty ensured stability over time. Operatives learned to anticipate consequences and align behavior with the rhythms of authority he had established. Mistakes were addressed swiftly, yet success and discretion were recognized quietly, creating a culture in which compliance became habitual rather than imposed. Through this nuanced management of human behavior, Anastasia maintained operational efficiency, loyalty, and discretion across a sprawling and complex organization. His personal discipline remained a cornerstone of his effectiveness. Anastasia controlled his environment, interactions, and daily routines with precision, ensuring that his mind remained focused and capable of assessing both immediate threats and long-term challenges. Even casual observations, fleeting conversations, and subtle gestures were opportunities to reinforce strategy and assess loyalty. This mastery of daily life reflected the broader mastery he exercised over Murder Incorporated and the wider criminal ecosystem. By attending to both micro and macro details, Anastasia ensured that control extended seamlessly from his personal sphere to the sprawling operations under his command. The perception of Anastasia's authority became increasingly important during this period. The city seemed to carry the invisible imprint of his presence. Allies moved with care, rivals calculated each step, and even casual observers sensed a weight in the underworld that was rarely visible but always felt. Anastasia's influence was both psychological and structural, reinforcing compliance and deterring ambition without overt enforcement. The quiet certainty of his control shaped behavior across the criminal landscape, demonstrating the profound power of perception as a complement to action. As his dominance continued, Anastasia also focused on the sustainability of his legacy. He trained key lieutenants, reinforcing operational and strategic principles, and ensured that knowledge and authority were distributed in ways that would preserve efficiency and cohesion. The continuity of influence became a central concern, and the organization's resilience was strengthened through meticulous planning, observation, and reinforcement of behavioral norms. By embedding these principles deeply within the organization, Anastasia ensured that both the structure and the perception of power would endure even in his absence. Even at this height, Anastasia never allowed complacency. He was acutely aware that power attracted scrutiny, envy, and challenge. Rival factions, ambitious subordinates, and the ever-present reach of law enforcement required constant monitoring. Anastasia's vigilance became a tool of strategic control, allowing him to anticipate disruptions, neutralize potential threats, and maintain equilibrium. Each interaction, each decision, and each subtle maneuver was measured against its long-term impact, ensuring that influence remained absolute and perception aligned with reality. The mythos of Anastasia reached its peak during this period. Stories of sudden retribution, flawless execution, and near-omniscient awareness circulated quietly, reinforcing both fear and respect. The line between fact and legend blurred, amplifying his authority even among those who had never encountered him personally. This reputation became a self-reinforcing mechanism, guiding behavior, deterring challenges, and ensuring that his influence extended far beyond the direct operations of Murder Incorporated. His mastery of perception allowed him to maintain dominance in a world defined by uncertainty, ambition, and constant change. By the early 1960s, Albert Anastasia had become more than a man, he had become a symbol of disciplined authority, strategic foresight, and psychological mastery. Fear, respect, and loyalty were woven into the fabric of Murder Incorporated, and the city itself reflected the quiet rhythm of his influence. His combination of operational skill, personal discipline, and understanding of human behavior allowed him to maintain control in an environment where power was fleeting and attention was relentless. Every action, observation, and subtle gesture reinforced the intricate network of influence he had built over decades. Through these years, Anastasia demonstrated that true power in the underworld was not a matter of brute force alone. It was the careful blending of foresight, discipline, perception, and psychological mastery. Each decision, observation, and action contributed to a system of control that ensured the survival, efficiency, and enduring dominance of Murder Incorporated. His vigilance had become strategy, his precision had become influence, and his authority had become an almost invisible yet unassailable force shaping the criminal landscape of New York. By the mid-1960s, Albert Anastasia had become a figure whose influence was both pervasive and enigmatic. The underworld of New York seemed to operate under an unspoken rhythm that reflected his subtle yet absolute control. Murder Incorporated remained efficient and disciplined, a testament to decades of meticulous planning, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. Yet even as his dominance appeared unassailable, the cracks of ambition, rivalry, and human unpredictability began to emerge, reminding Anastasia that power was never permanent and that the very presence that secured obedience could also provoke envy and betrayal. In these years, his awareness became both shield and instrument, allowing him to anticipate threats and shape outcomes before they fully materialized. Anastasia's approach to leadership had matured into a sophisticated balance of vigilance, strategy, and psychological mastery. He understood that authority extended beyond direct action, it resided in the perception of control, the anticipation of behavior, and the subtle orchestration of both fear and respect. Operatives internalized these expectations, acting with precision and discretion, while rivals hesitated in the knowledge that any deviation or challenge could provoke consequences that were as inevitable as they were calculated. In this environment, efficiency and loyalty became instinctual, a natural extension of the rhythm Anastasia had established over decades. The operational precision of Murder Incorporated under Anastasia's continued guidance was remarkable. Contracts were planned with exacting attention to detail, operatives positioned strategically, and actions executed with a combination of timing, discretion, and calculation. Yet the true genius of Anastasia's leadership lay not solely in the mechanics of execution but in the management of perception. Fear and respect were cultivated quietly, as subtle certainty rather than overt spectacle. Even rivals who never directly faced him adjusted their behavior based on the intangible weight of his presence, demonstrating the profound influence of psychological authority in shaping the dynamics of power. Adaptability remained a cornerstone of Anastasia's strategy. The criminal landscape was constantly shifting, with rival factions probing for weaknesses, ambitious subordinates seeking opportunity, and law enforcement exerting intermittent pressure. Anastasia's response was both measured and preemptive. He anticipated challenges, adjusted alliances, and deployed subtle maneuvers to maintain equilibrium. His vigilance extended to both immediate operational concerns and long-term strategic positioning, ensuring that the organization's influence remained unchallenged and that perception and reality were closely aligned. Psychology was central to Anastasia's continued control. Fear alone could enforce compliance in the short term, but long-term stability required respect, discretion, and the internalization of authority. Subordinates learned to anticipate consequences, to interpret subtle cues, and to align their behavior with the rhythms of the organization. Mistakes were corrected swiftly and efficiently, while competence and discretion were quietly reinforced. This delicate balance of enforcement and reinforcement created a self-regulating system, allowing Murder Incorporated to operate with precision and cohesion even in the absence of constant supervision. Anastasia's personal discipline played an equally critical role. He maintained control over his environment, his interactions, and his daily routines, ensuring that his decisions were deliberate and informed. Even the smallest observations, a glance exchanged, a hesitation in speech, a shift in posture, were catalogued and interpreted for their strategic implications. This meticulous attention to both micro and macro details allowed him to maintain calm, measured control, projecting an aura of authority that extended from his personal life into every corner of the underworld he commanded. The influence of Anastasia was palpable throughout the city. Streets, docks, warehouses, and hidden corridors bore the subtle imprint of his presence. Allies acted with precision, rivals moved cautiously, and even those tangentially aware of his operations sensed an invisible weight that guided decisions, tempered ambitions, and constrained defiance. Anastasia's authority was both psychological and structural, a force that shaped the environment without overt enforcement, demonstrating the profound power of perception in reinforcing dominance and maintaining order. As his prominence grew, Anastasia increasingly considered the sustainability of his legacy. He focused on training lieutenants, embedding strategic insight, operational knowledge, and the psychological principles of control into the next layer of leadership. By distributing authority while maintaining oversight, he ensured that the organizational culture of discipline, discretion, and loyalty would persist beyond his immediate presence. This emphasis on continuity strengthened both operational efficiency and the enduring perception of Anastasia's authority, allowing his influence to extend across time as well as space. Even amidst apparent stability, Anastasia remained acutely aware of the fragility of power. Rival factions tested boundaries, ambitious subordinates calculated their moves, and the intermittent scrutiny of law enforcement demanded constant attention. Anastasia's vigilance became both defensive and proactive, allowing him to anticipate disruption, mitigate threats, and maintain equilibrium. Each decision, each subtle maneuver, and each interaction was measured against its potential long-term impact, ensuring that influence remained absolute and perception aligned with reality. By this stage in his life, Anastasia's reputation had become a blend of reality and myth. Stories of instantaneous retribution, strategic genius, and near-omniscient awareness circulated quietly, reinforcing fear and respect. The legend of Anastasia became a self-reinforcing tool, guiding behavior, deterring challenges, and amplifying the impact of his direct actions. Even as he remained physically present in only part of the city at any given time, his influence pervaded every corner of the underworld, shaping decisions and shaping the rhythms of criminal activity. The psychological mastery Anastasia exhibited was evident in his ability to anticipate human behavior and shape it subtly. He understood that control was not merely the imposition of authority but the cultivation of expectation and the orchestration of perception. Subordinates internalized the principles of discipline and discretion, rivals calibrated their ambitions, and the broader criminal ecosystem adjusted to the invisible rhythm he had established. In this way, influence became almost autonomous, extending far beyond direct oversight and reinforcing Anastasia's power across multiple layers of the underworld. By the mid-1960s, Albert Anastasia had transformed vigilance into strategy, fear into loyalty, and authority into a near-legendary presence. His leadership was a blend of operational precision, psychological acuity, and strategic foresight, ensuring that Murder Incorporated remained disciplined, efficient, and resilient. Every decision, every observation, and every interaction reinforced a network of influence that extended throughout the city, embedding control and shaping behavior in ways both tangible and subtle. His dominance was not merely physical but intellectual, a quiet yet pervasive force that guided the rhythm of the criminal world. In these years, Anastasia exemplified that true power in the underworld was not a function of brute strength alone. It was the combination of foresight, discipline, perception, and psychological mastery that allowed him to maintain dominance amidst constant uncertainty. Each calculated action, each subtle maneuver, and each observation contributed to an intricate system of influence that ensured the survival, efficiency, and enduring authority of Murder Incorporated. His vigilance had become strategy, his precision had become influence, and his presence had become an invisible yet unassailable force shaping the criminal landscape of New York. By the late 1960s, Albert Anastasia had cemented his position as one of the most formidable figures in New York's underworld, yet he remained acutely aware that dominance was never permanent. The city pulsed with ambition, rivalry, and hidden dangers, and even a man as disciplined and perceptive as Anastasia understood that power required constant attention. Murder Incorporated, the organization he had meticulously shaped, operated with quiet efficiency, each operative performing their duties with precision and discretion, and every alliance and contract carefully orchestrated to minimize risk and maximize control. The underworld moved according to rhythms he had instilled, yet he knew that human ambition and unpredictability could always challenge even the most entrenched authority. Anastasia's mastery extended far beyond direct action. He understood that fear could enforce obedience temporarily, but only respect, loyalty, and internalized discipline could sustain long-term control. Subordinates learned to anticipate consequences, interpret subtle cues, and align their behavior with the expectations he had established over decades. Mistakes were corrected swiftly, yet discretion, initiative, and competence were quietly rewarded, creating a self-regulating system that ensured Murder Incorporated functioned cohesively even when he was absent. Operational precision was matched by strategic foresight. Every contract, every meeting, every observation was calculated, ensuring that alliances remained stable, rivals were monitored, and law enforcement pressure was mitigated before it could threaten the organization. Anastasia anticipated shifts in the criminal landscape and adjusted subtly, maintaining equilibrium and reinforcing the perception of unassailable authority. His vigilance extended from the micro, body language, fleeting gestures, whispered words, to the macro, ensuring that the organization's influence and cohesion remained strong across the city. The psychological dimension of his control was equally crucial. Streets, docks, warehouses, and hidden corridors bore the invisible imprint of his authority. Even those who had never met him personally acted in cautious deference, aware of the weight of his reputation. Anastasia's influence became almost self-perpetuating, perception reinforced behavior, and behavior reinforced perception, creating a system in which compliance was habitual and loyalty instinctive. At this stage of his life, Anastasia also focused on continuity. He trained lieutenants, embedding principles of strategy, psychological insight, and operational efficiency into the next generation of leadership. By distributing responsibility while maintaining oversight, he ensured that Murder Incorporated's culture of discipline and loyalty would endure beyond his immediate presence. The city's criminal ecosystem, from its shadowed corridors to its bustling docks, reflected the invisible yet pervasive influence of Albert Anastasia, a testament to decades of vigilance, foresight, and mastery over both action and perception. By the early 1970s, Albert Anastasia's presence still loomed over New York's underworld, an invisible force guiding the rhythms of crime, loyalty, and fear. Murder Incorporated functioned with disciplined precision, its operatives acting with quiet efficiency, anticipating consequences, and understanding the subtle expectations of a man whose reputation alone commanded obedience. Anastasia's mastery was not only in action but in perception, fear and respect interwoven to shape behavior long before decisions were acted upon. Even as his dominance endured, the undercurrents of rivalry and ambition remained, a reminder that power required constant vigilance. Ambitious lieutenants, rival factions, and intermittent law enforcement scrutiny demanded careful observation, subtle orchestration, and preemptive strategies. Anastasia anticipated shifts, adjusted alliances, and demonstrated influence in ways that ensured compliance without spectacle, reinforcing both respect and caution. His personal discipline mirrored the operational rigor of his organization. Every gesture, glance, and conversation was an opportunity to assess loyalty, predict intent, and maintain equilibrium. Streets, docks, and hidden corridors bore his invisible mark, shaping the behavior of allies and rivals alike. Anastasia's influence extended beyond immediate action, becoming a self-reinforcing system of control that ensured Murder Incorporated's efficiency and cohesion while leaving an indelible impression on the criminal landscape of New York. As the final chapter of his life approached, Albert Anastasia's legacy had been quietly cemented across New York's criminal world. Murder Incorporated continued to operate with discipline and precision, a testament to decades of strategic foresight, psychological mastery, and careful cultivation of loyalty. Anastasia had learned that authority was most enduring when perception, fear, and respect worked together, shaping behavior in subtle yet powerful ways. Even in his absence, the rhythms of his influence persisted. Operatives acted with internalized discipline, rivals hesitated at the edge of his reputation, and the city itself seemed to bend to the invisible weight of his authority. Anastasia's power had become both structural and psychological, a pervasive force shaping the decisions of men, guiding loyalty, and constraining ambition. He ensured continuity through training lieutenants and embedding the principles of strategy, discretion, and operational control within the organization. His vigilance, foresight, and mastery of human behavior created a lasting network of influence, demonstrating that true power was not in force alone but in the careful orchestration of perception, anticipation, and subtle authority. Albert Anastasia's life reflects the quiet, enduring force of intelligence, discipline, and strategy in a world of danger and unpredictability. Even decades later, the invisible threads he wove across New York's underworld remain a testament to a man who transformed vigilance into strategy, fear into loyalty, and authority into an enduring presence that shaped a city long after he was gone.